The first topic we'll be covering this week, in week 3, is right brain damage, the consequences on communication. So, unlike the symptoms of aphasia, the symptoms of right hemisphere damage, they might be more difficult to detect during an initial casual encounter with an individual with right hemisphere disorders. Upon meeting an individual with RHD, you might get the impression that the person has a really optimistic response to their stroke. And then in later encounters, you might realize that they just have a really unrealistic appraisal of their own deficits. These individuals might be disoriented or confused, but seem like they aren't really concerned about their confusion. Or they might deny that they have a left hemiplegia and refuse to participate in physical or occupational therapy. So last week we spoke about left brain damaged patients. These patients still appear to be themselves and be similar to who they were before their accidents. On the other hand, right brain damaged patients they're perceived as being kind of different. So they no longer care for themselves or dress as carefully as they did in the past before their brain damage. And their face and their prosody, the rate and rhythm that they speak, they convey what's known as flat affect. So it's as if they're not really engaged in a conversation. Additionally, their behavior might be inappropriate. They might joke about topics that are very inappropriate in inappropriate situations. So lesions to the right hemisphere don't typically result in the same language loss patterns that we see in individual with left hemisphere lesions. So for that reason, that's why for such a long time we believed that the left hemisphere was the language center of the brain and the only place where language is processed. These disputes amongst the community of neuroscience they kind of tie into what we spoke about week 1, where there's the localization theory, where language is just processed in one section of the brain, versus the connectionism theory, where it's processed throughout the brain. So rather, the right hemisphere has been connected with processing emotions, visual spatial materials, music, and so on and so forth. So that brings us to this slide here. In their book, Language in the Brain by Lorraine Obler and Chris Gerslow, they discuss a case of a hemispherectomy, which is a removal of half of the brain, one hemisphere of it. They present a small number of children who had a disorder called Sturge-Weber-Dimitri syndrome, and that results in problems with blood supply to the cerebral cortex. So the best way to address this issue in these children is to remove the entire affected hemisphere early on in their lives. So the removal of one hemisphere or half of the brain is called the hemispherectomy. So just to reiterate, individuals with right hemisphere damage, their speech is characterized by inappropriate prosody. So they have that flat affect, that monotone, just speaking at one level kind of speech. They don't make any facial expressions that make them appear engaged. They also have difficulty appropriately expressing and comprehending emotional context of communication. So both their comprehension and production are impaired. Also, they have a tendency to kind of go off on tangents. They have poor topic maintenance skills. Their communication is filled with irrelevant, repetitious detail and just like an overall lack of organization and a lack of an overall theme. So here I have a language sample for you guys to see from an individual with right hemisphere damage. I'm going to try to read part of it using a flat affect. So it would be like, see him flying a kite, sitting there, sailboat, see a guy flying a kite, sitting, nice big elm tree. And one of the things that I want to point out to you as you are reading it, I want you to see how redundant it is. He constantly is mentioning the kite, somebody taking a boat ride. It's redundant, it's all off on a tangent, but it really lacks an overall theme. It lacks organization. And it's just full of repetitious detail. Attentional and visual spatial disturbances are seen in individuals with right hemisphere damage. Individuals with right hemisphere damage can present with difficulties reading maps and remembering familiar routes. They also can have difficulty recognizing familiar faces. Individuals with right hemisphere damage also tend to suffer from what is known as unilateral neglect. So unilateral means one-sided, and it is defined as a failure to respond to stimuli on the contralateral side of brain damage. So let's think of this together. If an individual has right hemisphere damage, the contralateral side would be the left side, so they would have a left-sided unilateral neglect. So in this slide here, I can show you sort of what an individual with left unilateral neglect would be seeing or doing. So in some of the assessment tools for right hemisphere damage, there are drawing portions. So you can see when the individual tries to draw a clock, they kind of put everything to the right side because they're not seeing that left side altogether. They're neglecting it. And then in the other picture, you can see that they only ate the food on one side of their plate. So they neglected all the food on the left side. The Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago evaluation, or the RICE, that's an assessment tool that includes measures that will help you assess visual scanning, tracking, writing, pragmatic communication, and metaphorical language. And then it also has a rating scale that will help you assess their level of attention, orientation, and awareness. You can also use an aphasia battery, such as the Boston Aphasia Battery or the Western Aphasia Battery, to assess the individual's naming, auditory comprehension, reading, and writing deficits. So when working with individuals with RHD, initially we should work on improving their attention skills, and we can also address the visual spatial deficits that they have. So on the next slide, I'm going to explain one of those in greater detail. Therapy should also target the individual's comprehension and production of emotional tone. So a task that would address that would be if we show an individual a picture of a bunch of faces and ask them to point to the face that looks angry. And then after that, we'll ask them to try to produce a sentence in an angry voice. We can also have them complete sequencing tasks and picture description tasks, but giving them like a time constraint during a description task could be helpful because it'll help the individual avoid their digression and their perseveration, which is when they get stuck on one word. So this picture here is that cancellation task that I just mentioned. And this task is going to help the individuals improve their visual spatial skills and sort of help improve awareness of their neglected side. And what you do is you present the individual with some written stimuli. So it's usually like letters, numbers, or symbols. So you could give them a grid that is 6 by 8, and they're all different letters, and tell them, find all of the Q's and the R's for me. And what they'll have to do is they'll have to trace the grid with their finger to be sure that they're getting all the way over to the left side that they're neglecting, and cross out or cancel out all the letters or symbols or numbers that you requested them to do. And you can tailor these tasks to be as difficult or as simple as they need to be based on the individual's severity of their deficits. So if you have a really someone who has a very severe unilateral neglect, you could even just start off by showing them 2 letters and just getting them into the habit of scanning to the left again. And the reason that tasks like this are important are that, like, improving the individual's visual spatial perception can ultimately help them improve their reading and writing skills. And this can help them just improve that awareness of that neglected side. Now, this concludes our first lecture of this week on right brain damage and the consequences on communication. I hope that you guys feel like you learned a lot, and if you have any questions, as always, please post them in the student questions forum. Thank you.